Have you ever noticed how some artists, they're not just making art, they're like building this whole image around themselves?
Oh, absolutely.
Like you think about Andy Warhol, right?
Mm.
So deliberate about his persona, and it all kind of fed back into the art itself.
Yeah, it's all part of the package, you know?
It really makes you wonder about other artists who, well, blurred those lines between life and their work.
Right, right. Blurred the lines in totally different ways.
And that is exactly where we are diving in today, to the world of Joseph Beuys.
Beuys, oh man, he's fascinating.
He is. And he's having a huge moment right now. I mean, there's this major touring exhibition of his drawings.
Really?
Yeah, it's hitting all the big places like MoMA,
Wow.
MOCA in Los Angeles,
Yeah.
Philadelphia, even the Art Institute in Stuttgart.
That's impressive.
It really underscores, just how significant his work continues to be.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Beuys is one of those artists who, well, he just gets under your skin, you know?
He does.
He makes you think, makes you feel, maybe even a little bit uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And, for our deep dive today, you brought this fantastic resource,
Ah,
the
yeah.
catalog from the exhibition, Thinking is Form.
Great catalog.
That's a great one. Even the title itself, right? It kind of gives us a hint about what we're going to be exploring.
It does.
This idea that for Beuys, thinking, the act of thinking, it took on this tangible artistic form.
Right. It wasn't just an abstract process. It was something he could manifest.
Exactly. And that's really evident in his drawings, I think.
Oh, absolutely. The drawings are key. And this catalog, I think it really helps to cut through some of the, how should I put it, more layered interpretations of Beuys' work.
Layered, that's a good word.
It helps us get to the core,
Yeah.
what was he really about?
Exactly. To the core of his artistic practice.
Right.
This catalog, Thinking is Form, I mean, it is a serious piece of work. You can tell right away just the institutional weight behind it, the acknowledgments.
Right.
They thank Deutsche Bank, Lufthansa for their support.
Oh, wow. Serious players.
The copyright, it goes back to 1993 by the Philadelphia Museum of Art and MoMA, no less.
Yeah.
Published by Timms and Hudson. And it's got this chronology in the back that's so helpful.
I love a good chronology.
It maps out all of Beuys' exhibitions, his activities.
Oh, cool.
Right up to the early 1970s. And you get this real sense of, his early trajectory. You see these listings for shows in his hometown, Cleve, then Düsseldorf, even this Festum Fluxorum Fluxus event.
Festum Fluxorum Fluxus.
I know, right?
What a mouthful.
What a name. But yeah, you really get a sense of, where he was coming from, how he was developing. But as you said, I mean, the real heart of this catalog is the drawings.
Yeah, the drawings.
And these really insightful essays that explore them, throughout his whole career.
Throughout his career.
So our mission today is to really unpack what these drawings tell us about Beuys, about his artistic philosophy. What was he trying to communicate?
It's a good question. I think one of the first things that grabs you when you start looking at Beuys is this idea that, well, it was so well put by Richard Hamilton.
Oh, okay.
He said, "No artist of his generation so powerfully projected that disposition of his time, legitimized by Duchamp, for the artist's life to be his masterwork."
For the artist's life to be his masterwork.
Exactly. Duchamp, of course, being the artist who really shook things up with his ready-mades. He basically said anything can be art.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Hamilton's quote, it really highlights how Beuys, he just intertwined his existence with his art.
Yeah, like his life was the art.
In a way, yes.
That's a powerful idea. And I think the catalog, it immediately kind of refines that a little bit,
Okay.
It emphasizes that, yeah, Beuys linked his life and his work, but it's not like a simple one-to-one equation.
Right.
We can't just read his biography and think we've, solved the mystery.
Oh, no, it's much more complex than that.
It's much more complex.
And I think what's truly compelling is how Beuys used this interwoven approach, life and art, to grapple with some really, really heavy historical material.
Oh, okay. Like what?
Specifically, Germany's Nazi past.
Oh, wow.
He was coming of age in the shadow of that.
And so how did he do that? How did he deal with that in his art?
He took these romantic and folk images and motifs, things that had become almost taboo after the Nazi era.
Yeah, I can see that.
And he adapted them, subverted them in his work. It was this really charged way of engaging with memory and, well, guilt and trauma.
So it was a way of, I don't know, almost sneaking past the direct trauma.
Yeah, maybe.
and confronting audiences with this really difficult history, but through this artistic lens.
Exactly. And you can see how his own personal charisma, this almost magnetic quality he had,
Right.
it took on these really complex and ambiguous undertones after the Third Reich, this, very dark chapter in German history. Then you connect that to his concept of Gesamtkunstwerk.
Gesamtkunstwerk.
It's this romantic ideal of a total work of art. It integrates multiple art forms into a unified experience. And you see him picking up these broken pieces of German culture, he had this phrase, homeopathic therapy, or the art pill.
The art pill.
Yeah. It makes you think, right, what do you mean by that? This idea of art as a subtle but potent remedy for society.
Right. Art as medicine. Like it
Yeah.
works on this deeper level to heal.
Exactly. It's not just about aesthetics. It's about something more profound. And to really understand where this perspective came from, I think it's helpful to look at his early life.
Yeah, let's do that.
He grew up in Cleve, a town right near the Dutch border, apparently very rich in both geological and cultural history.
Okay, interesting.
And then his family moved to Rindern, where they ran a grain and feed store.
A grain and feed store.
Yeah, he often talked about this early connection to nature, to these very basic elements.
I could see how that would shape an artist's sensibility.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Mhm.
dealing with grain and feed, these fundamental materials.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a backdrop. It really informed his later choice of materials, his understanding of natural processes, the cycles of life and death.
Right. And then, of course, you can't talk about Beuys without acknowledging the impact of World War II.
Of course.
I mean, he came of age during that time. It had to have a profound effect on him.
A profound effect on everyone who lived through it. The catalog itself doesn't go into granular detail about his specific wartime experiences, but the shadow of the war is always there.
Yeah, it's this kind of unspoken presence.
Exactly. It informs everything.
It informs everything. So the catalog does cover his education at the Staatliche Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf.
Okay.
He initially studied with the sculptor Walter Brooks, kind of to get his foot in the door.
That makes sense.
But then he moved to a more experimental class led by Ewald Matare.
Matare. Now, that's a name I haven't heard in a while.
Right.
Yeah. Tell me about him.
Well, apparently their relationship was, it was pretty intense. The catalog describes it as powerful but contentious. They butted heads, but there was also this deep respect.
Interesting. So even though they had their differences, Matare saw something in Beau.
Oh, absolutely. He even invited Beuys to collaborate on public and church commissions. I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
It is, especially coming from someone like Matare. So what happened next?
Well, Beuys left the Academy in 1951, and then there's this whole decade, 1951 to 1961, that the catalog describes as a period of intense seclusion.
Seclusion.
Yeah, and a profound spiritual crisis.
Oh, wow. That sounds intense.
It sounds really pivotal, like a fallow period that then leads to this burst of growth.
Yeah, you get that sometimes with artists, this period of withdrawal, and then bam, they come back with something totally new.
Exactly. And this was a time of deep intellectual ferment for Beuys. He was reading so much, like poetry, philosophy, literature.
I can imagine.
But he's also digging into science, folk traditions, even the occult.
The occult. Now that's intriguing.
Right. The catalog specifically highlights the influence of Goethe and the German Romantics, people like Schiller and Novalis.
Yeah, I can see the connection there.
That whole romantic idea of everything being interconnected,
Hmm.
the blurring of boundaries between humanity and nature, the spiritual and the material.
Like ties together, right?
Exactly. And this is where Rudolf Steiner comes into the picture with his spiritual science.
Rudolf Steiner. Okay, now I know that name, but I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Yeah, so Steiner believed that human sensory abilities extend far beyond just the physical realm.
Okay.
And his understanding of Christ wasn't the traditional religious view. For Steiner, Christ was this vital, creative force that's within all of humanity.
Interesting. So it's more about unlocking this creative potential within each person.
Exactly. And that's where Beuys got that famous line, everyone is an artist.
Right. Everyone is an artist. It's so well known, but people often misunderstand it, I think.
Yeah, it wasn't just a catchy slogan for him.
No, it was something deeper.
It came from this deeply held belief, rooted in Steiner's ideas, that everyone has this inherent creative potential. So, for you listening, the key thing here is that Beuys wasn't just playing around with these ideas. They weren't just intellectual exercises.
Yeah.
Steiner's belief in this innate human creativity, it became the bedrock of his philosophy. And his drawings, they were a direct manifestation of this inner universal creativity trying to find form.
Okay. That makes sense. So while he was going through this intense period of inner exploration, what else was going on in his life?
Well, there were some parallel developments.
Okay.
Like in his personal life, he married Eva Warmbach in 1959.
Okay.
And then in 1961, he had this really significant exhibition of works from the Van der Gritten collection at Haus Kokook in his hometown of Cleve.
So things are starting to move for him professionally.
Yeah, and then, even more remarkably, in that same year, he gets this surprising appointment as professor of sculpture at the Düsseldorf Academy.
Wow. Professor of sculpture?
Professor of sculpture.
That's a huge jump.
It is. And the catalog mentions that the faculty, they initially had some reservations about him.
Oh, really? Why?
They thought he was, too intense, maybe a little shy, not really the typical professor type.
I can see that, but clearly he won them over.
He did. And right around this time, he starts engaging with the Fluxus movement.
Fluxus. Okay, now that's a whole other can of worms.
It is.
But so important to understanding Beuys.
So important. And the catalog points out that he never officially became a member of Fluxus, but it provided this crucial context for him.
Oh, okay.
It helped him move his art beyond the traditional studio setting.
I can see that. Fluxus was all about breaking down boundaries, challenging convention.
Exactly. And what's so interesting is that Fluxus, it was often characterized by this collective spirit, sometimes even anonymity.
Right, right.
But it was within that environment that
Yeah.
Beuys really started to solidify his own unique artistic signature.
That's fascinating. So within this movement that emphasized the collective, he found his own individual voice.
He did.
Yeah.
And, we can't talk about Beuys without talking about felt and fat.
Ah, yes, felt and fat.
Those became his signature materials. He essentially moved away from traditional sculpture materials in the early 60s.
Okay.
Bronze, wood, all that. And he started organizing his sculptures around actions, exhibitions, and felt and fat. They became these really emblematic materials.
And everyone always talks about the autobiographical significance.
Exactly. The catalog mentions that too.
Yeah.
It's linked to his wartime experience.
Right, the story about being rescued by Tatars after a plane crash. They wrapped him in felt and fat to keep him warm.
Exactly.
But the catalog encourages us to look beyond just the anecdote.
Okay.
There's more to it than that. Like, think about the ambivalent resonance of fat. I mean, it's this perishable material kind of base.
Right. It's not what you typically think of for sculpture.
Exactly. And sculpture has traditionally been associated with permanence, monumentality,
Yeah. Grand statues, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. But he's using fat. It's ironic. It challenges all these established conventions.
Right. The form, the purpose, even the very status of sculpture.
Exactly. And the catalog connects this to the broader artistic mood of the time,
Oh.
like Claes Oldenburg's soft monuments.
Oh, right. The giant hamburgers and clothespins?
Yeah, and this general pushback against rigid, formalist criteria in art. This idea that art shouldn't just be a luxury item.
It should engage with real life, real materials.
Exactly. And fat and felt, they became part of this wider dialogue.
Okay. So he's pushing the boundaries of sculpture, using these unconventional materials. And then he also starts exploring performance art.
Right.
The catalog mentions his Siberian Symphony, Section 1, in 1963.
Siberian Symphony.
Yeah, he later said it contained the seeds of all his subsequent artistic activities.
Interesting. So it was kind of a turning point.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
And then came this really pivotal moment in 1964, the Festival for New Art in Aachen.
Oh, yes. I remember reading about this.
It was a pretty wild event. The catalog points out the historical context. It was the 20th anniversary of the failed assassination attempt on Hitler.
Oh, wow. So a very charged atmosphere.
Very charged. And Beuys, he does this very Dada-esque action, and it gets disrupted by angry students.
Angry students.
Angry students. And he ends up getting punched.
Oh, no.
There's this really famous photograph of him standing there, bloodied nose, raised arm, holding a cross.
Yeah, I've seen that image. It's powerful.
It's an iconic image.
Mm-hmm.
And the catalog emphasizes how widely it was circulated.
Right. It kind of made him a celebrity in a way.
It did. And I think it was this, almost accidental collaboration, this event, that really brought him notoriety.
And it probably made him realize the power of cultural action. Right?
Exactly. It showed him how art could be this potent political force. And it also marked his first real encounter with government authorities.
So his art and his political engagement, they're becoming more and more intertwined.
Truly inseparable.
Yeah.
And speaking of politics, the catalog describes his political views as just as unconventional and challenging as his art.
Okay.
Very much in line with the 1960s, the whole questioning of authority.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going
A
around.
lot of that going around. So he co-founds the German Student Party in 1967.
The German Student
It
Party.
wasn't like a traditional political party. They called it a meta party.
A meta party? What does that even mean?
Well, they weren't just vying for power. They were questioning the whole concept of parties themselves.
Okay.
It all goes back to that idea everyone is an artist.
Right.
But for Beuys, it wasn't just about art.
No, it was about taking responsibility.
Exactly. Everyone has a responsibility, a creative role to play in shaping society.
Yeah, I can see that. So how did his teaching fit into all this?
Well, his role at the Dusseldorf Academy, it became a real extension of his political activity. And it definitely caused some controversy. The catalog mentions that some of his colleagues, they withdrew their support for him in 1968.
Oh, wow. Why?
They cited his iconoclasm, his almost messianic aura, and all the stuff going on with the German Student Party.
Yeah, he was a polarizing figure for sure.
And this is also around the time that the critic Ursula Meyer, she writes this famous report on his How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hair action.
Oh, right, the one where he's cradling the hair, whispering to it.
Exactly. I mean, you can imagine the kind of reactions that provoke.
Yeah, people were either fascinated or completely baffled.
Exactly. But all this resistance, it didn't deter him from his commitment to educational reform.
Okay, so he had a plan.
He did. He started developing plans for an alternative system, something that would empower students and prepare them to be active participants in society.
Sounds ambitious.
It was. And it led to the preliminary plans for the Free International School for Creativity and Interdisciplinary Research in 1971,
Okay.
and then the 1972 Manifesto, co-authored with Heinrich Böll,
Heinrich Böll, the Nobel laureate.
the very same. And then the first branch of the school is established in Dusseldorf in 1973. The catalog really highlights how they defined student in this context. It wasn't just someone enrolled in classes.
So who was a student to them?
It was every man whose personal interest lay in the process of learning and of spiritual development.
Wow. That's a pretty broad definition.
It is. And the whole idea was to bring together people from all different fields with the understanding that everyone is both a teacher and a student.
Okay.
And they wanted to apply creative thinking to all aspects of life,
Not just to art, but to work, to politics, to everything.
everything. And they had this incredibly ambitious vision. They wanted to establish the university worldwide.
Wow.
Yeah, they wanted to start in regions marked by conflict, like Ireland.
So bringing people together through education, through creativity.
Exactly. And eventually they did have affiliates in various countries.
It's amazing how far-reaching his ideas were.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, this whole idea of applying creativity to every facet of life, it connects directly to his concept of social sculpture.
Social sculpture.
It's his expanded definition of art.
Okay, so what does that actually mean? What is social sculpture?
Well, the catalog details his 7,000 Oaks project, which he initiated at Documenta 7 in 1982.
Okay.
He wanted to plant 7,000 oak trees in the city of Kassel, alongside these basalt columns.
7,000 oak trees. That's a lot of trees.
It is. And it was more than just planting trees, Think of it this way. Instead of carving marble, Beuys saw society itself as the material he was working with.
Wow, that's a huge shift in perspective.
It is. He was trying to shape society through ideas and actions.
And the 7,000 Oaks Project was part of that.
Absolutely. It was this incredibly powerful act of reforestation.
Yeah.
But it was also a deliberate blurring of the lines between traditional art objects and real-world action. And the oak tree itself, it has this complex symbolism. The catalog points out its historical association with Nazism, but also its much older sacred significance in German culture.
Right, it's loaded with meaning.
Very loaded. And the final tree was planted by his son, Wenzel, at Documenta 8 in 1987, after Beuys had passed away.
Oh, wow. So it became this kind of living memorial.
It did. It was a real statement about long-term legacy.
Yeah. So from this broad concept of social sculpture, he also transitions into more formal political engagement?
He does.
Right.
The Free International University, it played a really significant role in the founding convention of the Green Party in 1979.
The Green Party.
The Green Party. And Beuys himself, he was one of the 500 founding members.
Wow. So he went from this more radical meta party to helping found a real political party.
He did. And the catalog points out that initially, the Green Party, it was conceived as an anti-party.
An anti-party. So back to those earlier ideas.
It all circles back, doesn't it?
It does. So we've
Yeah.
talked about his sculpture, his performance art, his political activism, his teaching.
Just a lot to cover.
It is. But what about the exhibitions themselves? How did he approach those?
Well, the catalog talks about how Beuys, he saw exhibitions as an art form in themselves.
Okay.
And this really came to the forefront with his retrospective at the Guggenheim in New York in 1979.
Oh, yeah, the Guggenheim
Yeah.
with the spiral ramp.
Exactly. He conceived of the whole installation as 24 distinct stations along that ramp.
So he was really shaping the visitor's experience.
He was. It wasn't just about passively displaying works. The catalog also points out that he was very aware of creating lasting monuments.
Okay.
They draw a parallel to Duchamp. You know, how Duchamp left very specific instructions for how his work should be preserved and displayed.
Oh, right.
Well, Beuys, he had a similar agreement with the industrialist Karl Stroher,
Okay.
and that led to the permanent installation of his work at the Hessisches Landesmuseum Darmstadt.
So he was thinking about how his work would live on even after he was gone.
Exactly. So we've taken this deep dive into the catalog. We've explored all these different facets of Joseph Beuys. I mean, it's been a journey.
It has.
What would you say is the central takeaway regarding his drawings? Why are they so important?
Well, I think the catalog makes it clear that for Beuys, drawing wasn't just a preliminary step. It wasn't just a way to plan out other works.
Yeah.
It was a fundamental mode of thought for him.
Okay.
This direct, unfiltered connection to his ideas. And it was absolutely integral to his whole concept of social sculpture,
Yeah.
his expanded definition of art.
Right.
His drawings, they're like this nexus point. They connect his personal experiences, his spiritual beliefs, his political activism, all in this really profound and unique way.
That's so well put. And there's this one detail in the catalog that just stuck with me. It mentions this idea that Beuys, at James Joyce's request, he added 2 chapters to Ulysses through his drawings.
Wait, what? James Joyce? Ulysses James Joyce?
The one and only. I know. It's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, how do you add chapters to Ulysses through drawings? It's mind-boggling.
It really is. It just leaves you with so many questions. What was the nature of that request? What was their relationship like? I mean, these were 2 monumental figures.
It makes you think about the boundaries of collaboration, you know?
Yeah.
How artists can engage with each other's work, even across different mediums, across time.
Across time, yeah. And, on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. We've talked about Beuys's core belief that everyone is an artist. How might that perspective change the way we think about creativity? What if it's not something limited to a select few, but an inherent human capacity?
It's a radical idea, isn't it?
It is. And how might that change the way we act in the world? What if we all embraced that creative potential and used it to shape the society around us?
That's a big question.
It is. But Beuys's work, his life, it challenges us to think about those things. It challenges us to see the potential for individual action, the power of art, to make a real difference.
And to think that it all started with a simple question: what can art do?
And for Beuys, the answer was everything.